Hey, welcome to Caritas Querens. On the day that I make this recording, it's 2 days before the Feast of All Saints, November 1st, and I plan to release it on November 1st, on the day. As a Catholic, this is one of the biggest days in the church year, and I know that even a lot of Protestant denominations celebrate All Saints' Day. So I wanted to make a little video about All Saints' Day and the meaning of this day. And I want to share with you kind of a different perspective that I have on it this year. And I hope it'll give you some insight as well, and maybe make you more appreciate this day. And if you celebrate it, if you don't celebrate it, maybe celebrate it for this reason. So first off, let me just share, in the past, whenever I would celebrate All Saints' Day or think about this and ponder the meaning of it, I oftentimes would kind of see it as, okay, so throughout the church's year, in the Catholic Church, we commemorate different individual saints on different days, okay? So, for instance, everybody knows March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, right? A few days later, March 19th is St. Joseph's Day, and there's a whole slew of them. Every day has some saints commemorated, even if they're not commemorated actually like at Mass, like at the public worship service. So I always thought of it as, okay, well, this is like a day to celebrate all those other saints that are in heaven whose names are not like recorded, are not mentioned in public worship, are not in the roll books of the church, in the what's called the martyrology. And in fact, I remember even hearing a sermon one time years ago where the priest said, "This is the feast of the little guy." In other words, this is for all those saints that are forgotten, or saints that whose names we've never known, and so on and so forth, right? And I still believe that. I still think that's true, that this is a day to celebrate all the saints. But I want to share kind of a new perspective I have on it, especially from a universalist angle. And as I've said before, I think, and I will continue saying this, it is my belief that the doctrine of apokatastasis, or universalism, really greatly enriches the rest of what we as Christians believe. I think of it as sort of like a missing puzzle piece, but a really big one, And without that puzzle piece, you can see elements of the faith. But once you put that missing piece in, and I think it's a big one. It's like, it's taken up like a third of the puzzle. Finally, other things make sense, and you see them more fully. You see them completed. So it is my belief that universalism enriches and completes the rest of our faith. And here's my take on it for All Saints' Day. So I want to start by reading a passage from the Epistle of Paul to the Colossians, and I'm going to start at verse 9, chapter 1, verse 9, and read up through verse 14. So St. Paul says, "From the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will, in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power, according to His glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." So I want to go back to almost the very beginning of that passage, where Paul is praying here for the saints. In fact, he says in the very beginning at verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2, "To the saints and faithful brothers in Christ at Colossae." So he is writing this to the believers, the Colossians, whom he calls saints. And he prays that they may be filled with the knowledge of His will, of God's will. And that really struck me, because I was thinking about that and thinking, so what is so important about this? And after that, Paul goes on to mention all these things, that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will, so as to, and so in the other, he lists like all these effects, all these purposes. Here's why I want you to be filled with God's will, so that you may walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him, bearing fruit in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power, giving thanks to the Father. So he kind of makes it sound like if we are filled with the knowledge of God's will, then all of these other things will happen naturally to us. They will be natural consequences of that. So what's so important about this? And what does it mean to be filled with the knowledge of God's will? Okay, so let's think about this a little bit. St. Paul also says elsewhere, "This is the will of God, your sanctification, So if we want to ask the question, what is God's will? What is this will of God that Paul prays that we will have knowledge of for all of these good effects that he lists in Colossians chapter 1? What is that will? Well, he says it elsewhere. It is our sanctification. In other words, our being saints. And I want to just mention briefly about what the Greek word he uses here. So the Greek word he uses for will is thelema, and it comes from the Greek verb thelo, which can be translated variously. It often is translated as to wish or to will or desire. But I looked it up again earlier just to kind of refresh my memory. And in the Liddell and Scott lexicon, which is a standard ancient Greek dictionary, it says in the entry there, it says that thelo is kind of in opposition to another Greek word, boulomai, which also can be translated as to wish or to will. And it says that thelo has the distinct sense of to will in the sense of giving assent to something, not just to desire, to want something wistfully or something like that. That would be more like boulomai. Okay, so maybe the best way I could explain it is to say that boulomai is kind of like a willing of desire, like a wishing. And thelo, again, the word that Paul uses when he says, this is the will of God, your sanctification, thelo is more of a willing of intent. Okay, so it's kind of like, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut, right? So it's kind of like the difference between saying, I want to be an astronaut and saying, I intend to be an astronaut, okay? Boulomai is saying, I want to be an astronaut, It sounds so cool. It looks so neat. I'd like to wear the suit. I'd like to go up in space. And it sounds, so you have an enthusiasm for it. You have a desire for it, okay? But it's different to say, thelo. I have an intention. I intend to be an astronaut. That implies that your desire goes beyond just enthusiasm or emotional interest to actually developing a plan. And actually deciding with some kind of firmness, with some kind of continuation, that you're going to follow through with this. It's interesting, isn't it, that the word that Paul uses to describe God's will here is thelema, which comes from thelo, which is a will of intent. In other words, I think you could almost translate it by saying, this is God's intention, your sanctification. This is what God plans to do. Sanctify you, make you holy, okay? And then isn't it interesting that in the beginning of this epistle to the Colossians, he addresses the people at Colossae as the saints. And in the passage I read a little bit ago, in chapter 1, verse 12, he says that the Father has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints. So in other words, God's will is not just some kind of wishy-washy, wistful hoping against hope or desiring, but it is God's strong plan and intention to do what he wants to do, to bring it to fruition. So in other words, God is not just some kind of like grandstand spectator who's kind of cheering us on and saying, all right, good job down there below. I'm rooting you on, okay? I want you to become saints. Win, 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 something like that. On the other hand, God's will is not just some sort of general desire, like some people say that God has an antecedent will, which is a universal salvific will. In other words, God inherently wants everyone to be saved, but he has a consequent will. He also says, well, but I'm going to see how things turn out. I'm going to see what kind of choices they make, and that if they make the right choices, then I'll give my stamp of approval, I'll confirm it, and they'll be saints. If they make the wrong choices, then they lose, and I'm going to give my stamp of approval to that as well, and approve them to be punished or condemned. Okay, that's not what it is. It's God saying, I have a plan, I have an intention, and I mean to bring it to fruition. And so I've drawn up the blueprints. I've already sent the architect down there. He's already built the temple. He is the temple. And I'm in the process now of making each one of you living stones in that temple, members of the body of my Son, saints. In fact, you are already, in a sense, saints, he says. You've already been qualified to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. That is God's will. And no wonder Paul wants us to have knowledge of his will, because that knowledge that God wills, that he intends, that he plans, to make us holy, to sanctify us, boy, how freeing that is, how wonderful it is. I mean, certainly it does lead us to walk in a manner worthy of Him, pleasing to Him, bearing fruit, being strengthened with all power. I can say that my experience with this and with others I know who are interested in or have accepted universalism is that I see those fruits that Paul has predicted, that Paul enumerates there after he prays that we may be filled with the knowledge of God's will. So this All Saints' Day, maybe don't just celebrate all the little guys. Don't just celebrate all the saints whose names are lost to history or whose names were never recorded in the annals of the church's public worship. But maybe rejoice in them, but also rejoice, as our Lord said, that your name is written in heaven. Rejoice that God has a plan for you. Rejoice that God has a will for you, a will, a fellow will, a will of intention, a will of planning, a will of strongly desiring and intending to carry out your salvation. That's a wonderful thing, I think, to celebrate on this All Saints' Day and every All Saints' Day. In fact, every day. So anyway, thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed this or appreciated this, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing with others. And as always, I greatly appreciate any feedback you have for me. Put it in the comments box below. Happy All Saints' Day to you, and adios.